All right. Welcome, everybody. So I have here today with me Kevin Nontradicath. And wonderful for you to be here, Kevin. I'm really excited about this conversation. We should get this going by mentioning, first of all, that first of all, I think we garnered interest. You were interested in some video that I put, just kind of briefly mentioning this debate about whether numbers are real. Do you want to speak to like how you found that and like what your background interest in this is?
Yeah. So I think the way that I found your channel might have been through Kyle's Discord server, Kyle Whittington.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I found that not a lot of like the people, not a lot of like the Catholic apologetic space really talks a lot about philosophy. There's plenty of people who talk about like scholastic philosophy, but not a ton beyond that in my experience. So I thought that your channel was pretty interesting.
Cool.
And why this stuff matters to me is so I'm for the audience. Hi, my name is Kevin. I am ex-Catholic. Now, by that I don't mean that I'm excommunicated. I don't mean that I wrote a letter to my bishop asking him to strike me from the baptismal destroy my baptismal certificate. So I am technically still Catholic. I'm just not a practicing one, or perhaps like a very bad one.
And you're certainly not anti-Catholic.
No,
you would say, right.
I certainly do not think of myself that way.
Right.
I've been accused of it plenty of times, but
no.
it's never on purpose. But when I was coming out of like Catholicism, because obviously it's not like ever like you just wake up and decide. But I was simultaneously exploring philosophy, and in particular, I was exploring like realism because of transubstantiation. And this was happening when I was at engineering school. So this happened to me in this context where I thought to myself, like, I'm learning about like all these models of how the world works, and none of them seem to include substances and accidents,
Right. You mean in engineering school?
Exactly.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect them to.
Right. So then I thought to myself, like, I guess let me take stock. Do I really think that these things are like, they're real? Is realism real? And so I started reading up on it, and I wound up falling on the side of nominalism. And that was kind of like one step. It definitely wasn't. It's not like I read a paper on nominalism and was like, wow, I'm convinced I'm not Catholic anymore. It certainly did not happen like that. But I did wind up realizing that I was more closely aligned with the nominalist position than I was with a realist position of any stripe, Platonic or moderate. And then that was kind of just one step, in this huge staircase that led me away from the Catholic Church. Maybe it's like the staircase to hell or something like that.
No.
But yeah, that's why I'm interested in it.
Interesting. So, did you take it that the Catholic view necessarily has to be a realist view? So that's kind of what drove you away. It couldn't have been the only reason that you were like, say no, say goodbye to Catholicism. But this was, you looked at it as probably like a kind of hand in hand link between Catholicism and realism. And so once the realism goes, this goes, or it's easier to. Okay, I see.
Yeah, at the time, I definitely would have said that Catholics are obligated to be some kind of realist. Like, you can't be a nominalist and a Catholic. That was my position.
Oh, okay.
I've since moved on that. And the person that you can thank for moving me on that mostly is Jimmy Akin. Because I had a conversation with Jimmy Akin where he told me, he's like, yeah, I'm probably a nominalist and I still consider myself Catholic.
Yeah.
So I said, like, what do you do about transubstantiation? And he said a careful reading of like the Council of Trent doesn't actually obligate any Catholic to believe in transubstantiation. It does obligate Catholics to believe in the real presence. And the Council of Trent put forward transubstantiation as like a means to explain the real presence. But if you are a nominalist, you can kind of feel free to reject that explanation of the real presence. You still have to accept the real presence, but you can try to formulate the idea of the real presence in nominalistic, like not like nominalism friendly terms, if you so choose to take up that project.
That seems right to me. I mean, I was doing a little reading, in the hours leading up to this, for whatever that's worth. I had to pull some very dusty books from my shelf that I hadn't touched in a while, and because the thing is, like, although I do have the doctorate in philosophy, I don't specialize in this area, so please don't expect me to run circles around you. I do not have well-formed views on this topic, but what I learned was that, of course, Occam. William of Ockham is like really a big nominalist. He's well known for that, but he's a Franciscan friar.
A Catholic, yes.
Yeah, Franciscan friar, was a Catholic. And also Aquinas, many people think that his view is a nominalist view. Some people will say he's a moderate realist. Some people will say he's a nominalist. But scholars differ on that.
I've even seen some scholars talk about how, like, the position of moderate realism might be a lot more nominalistic than, like, we kind of tend to think of it today. Like, if we went back to, the 12th century or whatever, and we tried to, like, impose our modern categories of, moderate realism versus nominalism, Aquinas might kind of look at you funny and be like, huh? Like, aren't we saying the same thing almost?
Yeah, I try to find, it depends on who you read, because each philosopher is going to have their different stipulative definitions of what they mean by this or that term. But there are well received, like, traditional conceptions of it, like real just means mind independent. You might be like, okay, I'm gonna go out on a limb here and mean by the term real, I'm gonna mean by something else. You're free to do that, but it also, in doing that, though you're free to do it, it engenders a lot more confusion if you're trying to write in the area. So many people do go with received definitions, but yeah, so it depends on who you read and how they construe these things. Like, I was reading just two philosophers who had they had a conversation in a journal. It was William Lane Craig was one of them, and the other guy was somebody I hadn't heard of, named J. Thomas Bridges. And Bridges held a Thomist account. He called it a moderate realism, but then Craig came back and said, well, that's actually a nominalism. That's not moderate realism, and what you mean by moderate realism isn't really moderate realism. So they're quibble over definitions. But Craig meant by moderate realism something like an immanence, that these properties are immanent within all reality, whereas Bridges didn't mean that. But so I guess we should get clear about our terms first, if that's fine with you, with your permission. So by real, I just mean something like mind independent. Are you fine with that sort of characterization?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Okay.
If you asked me, like, and I didn't hear your definition, I might say something like I might borrow from, like, a correspondence theory of truth and say that, like, something is real if it corresponds with something in the universe.
Okay.
But I think that both of our definitions are probably totally fine.
So let me ask you this too, not because it's a play on words or anything like that, trying to be funny or catch you anything, but so I mean by the universe, just the natural universe. And by the term world, I mean everything. So the universe, it's going to refer to spatiotemporal reality and everything in it. By the world, I mean all of that, the whole universe, plus these extramental things, these abstract objects like numbers. So the way I see it is that a realist would believe that the world exists and that things can exist beyond space and time, whereas the naturalist is going to just reject that. You're just going to say, well, no, the only thing that exists is going to be the things in the universe, in space and time. Does that seem right to you?
Yeah, it does. And I would also go as far as to say that I find myself using the term universe to mean like all that exists.
Okay. Gotcha. So let me ask you then, are you a naturalist then? Because a naturalist would just say that. The universe just is everything that exists. Okay.
Methodologically speaking, I find myself being a naturalist.
Okay.
Now, would I be so bold as to call myself, like, in principle, a naturalist? I'm not so sure. And the only reason I say that is because I'm not sure that I have any kind of argument whatsoever to say that, like, in principle, these things couldn't exist, like abstracta. But I have reasons why I think that even if abstracta do exist, it's impossible for us humans to come to any knowledge of them. And so methodologically, I'm a naturalist, if that makes sense.
Okay, got you. So are you a metaphysical naturalist then, or do you accept the existence of supernatural deities, God, angels, demons, and so on like that?
So I call myself an agnostic. So I don't actively affirm the existence of any of these things. But I tend to lean towards that they don't exist. Or if they do exist, they're just radically different from the way that I used to think about them.
Gotcha. Okay.
So yeah, that's kind of how I lean.
Got you. Okay. So I consider myself a realist, and as a Catholic, but I look at those things separate. I don't think that one necessarily is dependent on the other. I think you can be a realist and not be a Catholic. I think you can be Catholic and not be a realist. So I'll just talk about like the realism part. And in fact, like I was brought up under a professor who's like a really staunch realist, but not a Catholic. And so he maybe ingrained in me some views that I might need to reevaluate now that I am Catholic. Who knows? And get more clear on, Thomas Aquinas' position perhaps, or maybe look at other scholastics or doctors of the church or something and see what they have to say. But it's my understanding. I mean, of course, like we're not going to solve this debate right now because this has been going on since Plato and Aristotle, all through the Middle Ages. In fact, probably the most fundamental metaphysical debate that there is. So let's just think about numbers. Where do numbers exist? I would say yes. What would you say?
I'd say no, because numbers are an example of abstracta, and I don't think that any abstracta exist.
Okay, gotcha. So we can talk more generally about abstracta then. So no abstracta exists. What accounts then for resemblance for you? Like, so if I say, like, I've got a blue bookshelf behind me, I've got blue in my tie, I'm wearing blue pants, it seems that those share resemblance. What accounts for that resemblance? Is it just a brute fact?
I've read a lot about like trope theory and things like that. Honestly, I'm not so sure that I see a huge difference between trope nominalism and moderate realism, if I'm being entirely honest. Because when you start talking about these tropes, I'm like, well, what makes a trope so different than a than like, redness, like why is the trope of redness different than like the abstracta of redness? I'm not entirely sure. So then I do kind of just lean on these things that we are calling resemblance. So the red in your tie and the red of the book behind you or whatever it is. The things that I think the reason why humans refer to these things as both being red has to do with the wavelength of the photons. The wavelengths are going to be close enough that I can't detect the difference. And so I might call them both red. I might even call them both maroon or something like that. But the similarity is going to be grounded in some kind of fact about the universe. So I wouldn't call it a brute fact because a brute fact would mean that, like, I can't really explain why we think that they're both red. But I would appeal to some kind of fact about reality underneath. And in particular for this one, that fact about reality would have to deal with the wavelength of the photons as they're hitting my eye.
Gotcha. So you would ground it in just the physical features and attributes of those things. So let me use a different example of relations. Then relations, relata, are considered, well, the relation anyway is considered an abstract entity. So a relation like greater than, louder than, that sort of thing. That seems multiply instantiable and exemplifiable. But that's something that is really weird because, like, if I say, this room is larger than my bathroom, I can also say that, I don't know, this shirt is larger than my son's shirt. Like, what do those things share in common? It's not the physical attributes at that point. It's something that I seem to be abstracting from it and calling a relation, and a realist would say that that's real. That's not just something that I'm imagining, but it is real, and it's multiply instantiable, so that I can say a T-Rex is larger than a velociraptor or something like that. And I can even apply it to fictional characters and things like that. Hagrid is larger than Harry Potter. You know, it's like, it's weird. It's really weird, mystical things, mysterious things, I should say, that that seem to be applicable and instantiable in a multiple location that's in a way that's not dependent merely on the physical facts. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think that the way that a lot of my thoughts about like relations, it kind of just boils down to like quirks of human language. So when we say that, like, you know, one shirt is larger than another shirt, you know, I think that what we're referring to is like the collection of atoms that, like, you know, we perceive as a shirt. That collection of atoms, there are simply more of them than there are in the other shirt. And like, I don't think I need to appeal to anything beyond, you know, reality, to come up with, you know, phrases that convey that information, if that makes sense. So like, I just don't think that I'm like committing myself to any kind of abstracta when I observe that there are, you know, the simples that make up this shirt are more numerous than the simples that make up that shirt, you know?
Okay. But yeah, I guess we could also move it. So you're saying, okay, objects, they would just have like more atoms, whatnot. But there is a sense in which some ideas, let's say, are greater than other ideas, or some event is greater than another event. How would you analyze that then? To start with the idea.
Yeah, what would we mean when we would say that an idea is greater than? Would we mean something like, you and I are both brainstorming how to get across the river, and you know, I come up with the idea to build a raft, and you come up with the idea to build a bridge. But due to the current, being, you know, it's a raging river, your idea is greater than my idea. Is that kind of what we mean? Like, your idea is going to more effectively get us to the end goal?
It can. That's interesting, because it can be cashed out in terms of, okay, it's going to be a more effective idea. But this, I think adds to the mystery of the relation, because greater than can also truly be said of the idea of, you know, Euclid's geometry is a greater idea than remembering what I had for lunch yesterday. You know what I mean? Like, and both of those have the relation greater than, and they apply to ideas, but they apply in radically different ways.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would affirm that like Euclid's geometry was a greater idea than me remembering what I ate for lunch yesterday. Like, if somebody asked me, like, you know, Kevin, please affirm the idea that Euclid's geometry is a greater idea than yesterday's, you know, the gun to my head, maybe I'd say, sure, whatever you say. But if I wanted to actually like have a conversation, I might be like, well, I'm not sure that this is actually conveying any kind of real, like, I'm not sure that this is a factive statement here. I'm not sure that there is a fact of the matter about, you know, unless we mean more effective at determining the length of the hypotenuse. You know what I mean?
Got you. Yeah. Yeah, I see. Yeah, you could break that down to, like I just said, Euclid's geometry, but that needs to be analyzed in terms of, well, what are you referring to? Obviously not the book. You're referring to the ideas contained within the book, and which ones? The whole set of them? Well, in that case, there's more ideas there. And then, but they're okay, take one, you know? And then I'm not even familiar with the equations within Euclid's geometry, not Euler's. So I wouldn't be able to identify one, but let's just take what you were saying, the hypotenuse. So we'll take the Pythagorean formula. It seems to me reasonable to say that the Pythagorean, thinking about how to calculate the hypotenuse of a right triangle, is a greater idea to think than to think the thought and of the memory of what I had for lunch yesterday. That seems like pretty plain, and without need of explanation. But I suppose, like, but it seems like you're needing to deny that simply because then you would admit there would be a greater than relation.
So I don't think about it that way, because
I'm not committed to greater than relation. By the way, I should know. Sorry, I should know that I'm not necessarily like a really staunch realist. I could be talked into like a moderate realism or a form of nominalism that's consistent with realism, a sort of like abstracted realism that looks a lot close to nominalism. So I could be talked out of these things. We're just having a chat.
Yeah, just kind of shooting the breeze.
Yeah.
The way that if I was firmly convinced of the idea that these greater than relations, there is a fact of the matter here. Okay,
Yeah.
all the worse for the nominalists then. Hey, that poor
Right.
sucker over there is still a nominalist, but I'm going to change my mind. So I certainly don't think about it like I'm like kind of stuck in here, but I do think that there is just no fact of the matter about Euclid's geometry being a greater idea than what I ate for lunch yesterday. The way that I view the word greater than used in this context seems to be making a subjective point about the value of something, and the amount that anybody values anything is going to be, subjective by definition. And if that's the case, then it's just not going to actually it's not going to obtain in the real world, really, right. Beyond the brain state of the person who's making the subjective judgment.
Yeah.
So it seems like greater than could be used to express size differences, like we were talking about earlier. It could also be used to express like a value statement.
Yeah. And then numeric value, you can say you have a greater number of eggs, for example. But you can also have a greater number of ideas, which is weird. This would apply to things that don't appear in reality in the natural world, let's say. But what do you think about ideas? What's your view on these?
I think that ideas are brain states. So I think that an idea is the same thing as, like, when we're talking about ideas, what we're actually talking about are the electrical signals that are being generated within brains. And so I think that there would be no ideas if there were no brains and things like that.
Yeah. See, I agree with that last thing you said. I do think that for human beings, perhaps, not for immaterial beings, I think that if you don't have the material substrate, then you're not going to get the ideas, the mental state. But I don't think that they're identical, because just thinking about these, if something has a property that the other doesn't have, then it's pretty clear that the two objects aren't identical. Or let's say the one object is actually two objects, let's say. So, so you just have to try to think of like, let's say an idea and then a firing of a neuron. Neurons, they have electrical impulses. Do ideas, are they made of electricity? It seems like not, unless you're just going to beg the question and say, well, yes, they do, because they're neurons. Or you could say, well, a brain has weight, but a mind doesn't have weight to it. It can't be made, unless, of course, you start with the assumption that the mind just is the brain. So all that to say, like, I'm not really bought into that, but that's good to know that that's your position. So when I bring up things like greater number of ideas or something, you could still then ground that in terms of, well, these are just that you have a greater number of particles and atoms and so on and so on. Greater number of neurons, perhaps, or
yeah. I mean, that would only apply to greater than in the sense of size, and I don't think that that's what most people mean when they would talk about ideas. No. I think that most people are talking about like value judgments. Like, I value this idea more than I value that idea. And then that'll just be plain old subjective.
Yeah. Let me ask, would you apply the valuing thing? Would you be a subjectivist about that with respect to like natural properties in the world with respect to your nominalism? So you'd say, well, it's because I value blueness in this or that way, and that's going to be the difference. So like when I identify something as blue, I'm valuing it in a specific way. And so like that is the differentiator. When I see a blue thing, I'm valuing it the same way. So does that make sense what I'm asking?
Maybe. At first I was going to say no, but then I thought about what you said, and maybe it's a yes. I think it depends on what exactly you mean by value. Here's what I do think. Here's why I think I might look at two different things and call them both blue. It's because I can't distinguish the difference in the wavelength of the photons. So that's, I guess, in some sense, that's inherently subjective, because I can't differentiate the difference with my eyeballs.
Right.
But if I had more cones or rods or whatever in my eyes, like women do, women have more cones and rods on average than men do. So they can see differences in colors that men can't, on average. Again, broad brush.
Right.
But so they might, a woman might look at the same two colors that I do, and I might be like, yeah, they're both blue, and the woman would be like, no, these are clearly different colors. I'd be like, no, they're not. And so in that sense, it's subjective. So if that's what you mean by valuing, then yes. But I think what's driving me to make the value judgment is the simple fact that I can't differentiate the wavelengths of those photons.
Yeah. So, okay. So that makes sense. And of course you could just be like, somebody like, I think it was John Locke or someone who distinguished between primary or secondary qualities and said color is just going to be a secondary quality. It's in the mind regardless. But I don't think he was a staunch naturalist or something. He just said with respect to certain properties, it's just going to be in the mind. But with respect to other properties like extension and shape, those aren't going to be in the mind. So it could be for you that you're praising and evaluating these things. You're like, okay, with colors, cool. We can like cash out in terms of my brain states, or maybe the way the wavelength hits my eye and I'm recognizing these, but with respect to like shape and extension, that's something that's in the physical world. I can go out and measure and then realize that it's the same shape or extension or something like that. Anyway, you want to push back on that or?
No, not really. Because you can look at two things and they look like they're different lengths, but it's actually an optical illusion. It's the same length.
True.
So then go ahead and measure it. So no, I don't think there was anything there that I really wanted to push back on. I think.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm just kicking these things around and still trying to get a handle on things. So, I'm wondering also about you had mentioned in our DMs before about applying this to Christianity with respect to God. Of course, I think as a Platonist realist, people are usually very cautious about being a Christian Platonist because they think that if you don't do anything with the transcendentals, with the universals, with the like properties that exist, the abstracta, then they're going to rival God and they're going to impinge upon his sovereignty and so on. And so many people take the route of there'll be a Platonist, but there'll be somebody like Plotinus or Augustine who puts these ideas in the mind of God, and that sort of seems to solve it, I suppose. But then it's really hard to like explain why it is or how it is, let's say, that when I'm identifying something like this red color in my tie, like I'm getting that from the mind of God, like I'm appealing to it in some way. Like, how's that work? You know what I mean? It's very mysterious.
I agree. I think that my experiences with Catholicism, so I'll say Catholic, but I imagine that this applies to like Christians and theists even broadly. But it does seem to me like it's tricky to be a monotheist and a Platonist. But then for Catholics in particular, I haven't met many. So I listed Jimmy Akin at the beginning. But I haven't met many Catholics who are quite happy to be like, yeah, I think that the Council of Trent was just plain old incorrect when it explained the mechanism by which transubstantiation occurs. Like, I think it takes a special kind of Catholic to say that. One who has, first of all, thought about the matter, Do
you mind if I interject here? So it's my understanding that dogmatically, you're really only, I mean, of course, like the speaking from the seat of Peter and speaking infallibly, there's that. But what the councils identify and declare as dogma, that's only going to be issues of faith and morals. What we have here is obviously an article of faith, the transubstantiation, but I mean, that's too simplistic. You would have to like dig in and be like and analyze. So what is it that's being declared dogmatically? Is it that properties are real? Because I think even anomalous. So let's say the properties and substance. You can talk about properties and substance both as a nominalist and as a realist. You see what I mean? It's almost like talking about morals, normative ethics, let's say, and then the same person, both a moral realist and a moral non-realist, can both talk with that language. You're just going to take different takes on this. So it's my understanding, like, we can talk about properties and substances, like you and I, even though we disagree on the status of universals and particulars and properties and so on, like whether they're real or nominal, but you can still discuss properties and substances. Does that make sense?
I might want to push back a little bit.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah,
particularly on the substance part of it. Particularly because substance is one of those really tricky words where different philosophers at different points in history have used that word to mean pretty different things.
Of course.
So I think that when Aristotle talked about substance, he actually meant something more similar to what the Council of Trent meant by accidents.
Okay.
That's my, and again, no degree in philosophy.
Yeah.
So only take my word for what it's worth. But
accidents in the sense of properties.
Yeah. So the Council of Trent talks about substances and accidents.
Okay.
Accidents. So for the Eucharist, this is not blasphemous for me to say. The Eucharist has the accidents of bread, and it will always have the accidents of bread.
That's right.
No Catholic would balk at that. That's just the accidents. But the substance is what the thing really is. And so the substance was the substance of bread prior to the sacrifice of the Mass. But then after, hocus enum corpus meum. Sorry, I was a trad.
Yeah.
So
that's all right.
And then all of a sudden, the substance has translated, it's moved out of the host, and a new substance has entered, and that new substance is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. So I'm not sure how a nominalist would be able to affirm substances in the way that the Council of Trent uses them, because the Council of Trent seems to be using this word to mean an abstracta.
So you're saying the Council of Trent seems to be using the word substance as an abstractum?
Yeah. I pulled up,
but doesn't that run up against the idea that that Christ is really present? So then it wouldn't be abstracted.
I don't think so, because the substance is what the thing really is. So it just has the accidents of bread. But what a thing really is has nothing to do with his accidents, according to the people who wrote the Council of Trent.
So I'm thinking of substance. I think in the way that Aristotle thinks of it, that a substance itself has actually like if you just think of a bare substance, it's not going to look like anything. It's not going to weigh anything or anything like that, because those are all properties. So the substance itself, it would be kind of untoward and incorrect really to call the substance itself actually bread. And some people talk about like a bundle theory, or like you have a bundle of properties and the substance is like the thing that all the bundle of properties goes into, like, and they just kind of connect to it. But the substance itself has no extension, has no shape, has no weight or look like anything or taste like anything like that. So when it's replaced, all they're saying is that whatever that thing was, again, like has nothing, no properties, all the properties remain, and that thing gets changed out, and now you have real substance of Christ there. But it's really, truly there. You're not abstracting. This is the way I understand it anyway. But then again, I haven't really thought about in terms of substances and particulars and properties in terms of the Council of Trent. I've really not looked into that. But you say you got it queued up here?
Yeah, so I can just read it real quick. So just like a few sentences. It's really just one big sentence on it.
Do you want to share it on screen? We can put it on screen.
That's a great idea. Let me do that.
Cool.
Let's see. Share screen, and then I can probably
Cool.
Okay, and then
put that there. There we go.
Cool. I got to scroll down a little bit. There it is. So and maybe I'll just scroll up to show you where I'm at. So this is papalencyclicals.net. And so this is the 13th session of the Council of Trent. So this session took place in 1551. And if we go down to chapter 5, it's called On Transubstantiation.
Okay.
And so the important part here is this Holy Synod, the Council of Trent, doth declare it anew that by the consecration of the bread and wine, a conversion is made of the whole substance of the bread into the substance of the body of Christ our Lord, and of the whole substance of the wine into the substance of his blood, which conversion is, by the Holy Catholic Church, suitably and properly called transubstantiation. And so I think that the people like Jimmy Akin who say that I don't have to actually, now that I'm reading this, I'm actually not so sure. Well, what Jimmy would say, and I hope I'm not putting words in his mouth, but it's something to the effect of like, hey, look, this is what we have to believe.
Right.
And then this is how they're labeling it. But who cares how they're labeling it? This is the part that we have to believe. Okay. But now that I'm reading this part again, they are talking about substances. So
So is it the case, this, correct me if I'm wrong, but is it the case that the debate about the reality of, say, these universals, let's say, the debate about universals, isn't a debate about substances, it's only a debate about properties. So if this speaks about substances, that's something that either side could agree on. That's my understanding.
So your understanding is that a substance would not be like an abstracta, it wouldn't be like a universal?
Right. Like yeah, somebody put it in terms in the well, it'd be a universal in the sense of what Aristotle calls a particularized universal. That we can abstract the idea that this thing's a substance, this thing's a substance, this thing's a substance. But does substance, the form of substance, exist? For Aristotle, of course not. It's just going to be this thing, this thing, this thing, this thing. Whatever it is that the property is inherent in. So it'll be universal in the sense that it's universally recognizable wherever it instantiates, let's say, wherever it manifests, but it's not going to be a form, let's say, something that exists, is an abstract entity.
So the way that I read the Council of Trent is that they are using the word substance to mean something like, so, and then form is another tricky word. Form and substance have both meant different things at different times. So the way that I've read the Council of Trent is that the stuff that makes it up is the accidents, but what it really is the substance. And so if that's how it is, then, because like, for instance, people who talk about substances will talk about the substance of tableness and the substance of chairness. And those appear to me to be pretty clear instances of universals.
That would be a Platonic view for sure. Yeah.
They'll sometimes talk about it in like moderate realist senses. So like I'm thinking in particular here of like, Bishop Barron will have sermons about chairness and tableness. So like Father Mike Schmitz, we could pull up a YouTube video. They're not philosophers, of course, but
right.
But they'll talk about substances like chairness, and they'll say that like God is so powerful that he could remove the. So here's my seltzer bottle. The bottleness of this bottle, God is so powerful that he could remove the bottleness from this bottle and then infuse it with Jesus Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity. He wouldn't, but he could. And so if we are talking about like, so, and for instance, in transubstantiation, the breadness is what is gone. The breadness was there.
I see. I think that's that wouldn't be my evaluation. I don't think that's right. I would say bottleness could not be taken away. I don't see. It's really hard to talk about artifacts, things that are made, and it's easier to use examples that are like natural kinds, like dog or something like that, or animal or humanity. But yeah, so I mean, like what makes a table or a chair? I mean, you're gonna have different answers to that. So they can be made in several different ways. But so with respect to the bottle, I don't think you can take away the bottleness. I don't think that's what you're doing. I think you're taking away properties. You say if you were to smash it or something like that, or if we could just transubstantiate the bottle, well, then all those properties would remain because you're, after all, only changing the substance. Somebody in the chat, Digital Gnosis, said this. This is one option. Where did it go? Talking about prime matter. Yeah. So I can't see where it went though, but the idea is that this term would just be the idea, like you were talking like a naturalist earlier, like things just are going to be, whether you want to talk about atoms or something, that would be like an atomistic approach that goes back to ancient Greece and something that we lean upon very heavily now. But metaphysicians, when they're talking about this, they won't even resort to that language, talking about the atoms that, because I mean, who knows? Maybe eventually we might go even lower than an atom and molecule and so on and so on. And we have, right? So whatever it is, it's like the smallest piece. It may not be atomistic at all. It may be
fields.
Instead of things, it might be stuff. You know what I mean? Like
right now,
it might be fields.
We think it's fields. That's
Yeah.
We think that all matter is just an excitation in a field. So.
Right. So that may be what it is. That's let's say the canvas, and then you can change the canvas out, but you're not going to change the painting. If that's probably a terrible analogy here, but so I take it to what it'd be happening. Transubstantiation is just what the Vatican II document says. It's like you're going to change the substance, but by changing the substance, you don't change the breadness, because that's the bread part just is one of the properties. That it has breadness, that it's in this form, this shape, that it's in a circular shape. Circularity, I take it to be a property. All of its weight, all of its physical properties, everything. It's just going to be all the properties. It's really hard to think about this because it almost makes you think like, does everything then just reduce to properties? There is no substances, and some people take this view. I think it is what I mentioned earlier, the bundle theory, is that there really is just nothing there. It's just that I mentioned this earlier. I don't affirm it, because I think the bundle theory, its problem is that if there's nothing there in which all the properties in here, then they're really just free floating particular properties. So like, what do they have to inhere in, So it could be like some people have said, like this prime matter stuff. But anyway, I've talked a lot. I'll let you jump in here.
Yeah. So I actually do think so. I have a pretty distinct memory of calling into Catholic Answers one time and telling them like, hey, so one of my issues, like one of the reasons I don't consider myself Catholic today is because I don't think that transubstantiation is possible, because I don't think that substances exist. So transubstantiation isn't possible if substances don't, right? Like, obviously. And I just think that things are what their accidents are. So if something has all the accidents of bread, it is bread. And anything that has all the accidents of Kevin just simply is Kevin, And the Catholic Answers team, they punted on me. They said, "Oh, go read Real Essentialism by Oderberg." And I said, "Okay, sounds good." But there was a reason I was going to tell that story, and then I told the story and I forgot the reason why I said it.
Yeah, we were talking about just views on which only properties exist. Yeah.
So I do think that what the Council of Trent is talking about with accidents, I think that is like, now, I don't exactly think that, because I think that even just that language is just not like the right language to actually describe how our world works. I think that the language of modern science is just way more useful than the language of 13th century science, and 16th century science for the Council of Trent. So in terms of just describing how the world works, like, it's not very useful. But if I was limiting myself to that language, I would say that I think that accidents are all that exist. Things are what their accidents are. That would be kind of me using 16th century language too.
Yeah. I understand the sympathy that, like, let's just go with the latest scientific theory or view of the world, hypothesis or so on. But I take it that science takes its cue from philosophy, from metaphysics. So like, if it's an atomistic view of the world, well, that's just a metaphysical view of atomism, or if it's going to be just like you said earlier, it's just going to be a field. Well, that's going to be Parmenides, his monism. Like, these views have already kind of been on offer already, and so and just like variations in that field, there's going to just be variations in views that we've already heard from. So I think all the logical space has already been laid out. So, and I also think that when scientists are doing this, when I think I'll say this: a physicist's job, as I understand it, is not to theorize. Although I do understand Darwinian sort of scientific method, ever since Darwin, is to form a hypothesis and then prove that hypothesis, to make a theory and then to fit the facts to that theory. I'm not sure if that's the best way to do it. But all that to say is, I think when they're theorizing, I don't think that that's the true formal business of doing physics, let's say. I think they're actually doing philosophy of physics. They're doing philosophy of science rather than doing physics itself. So I take the business of physics just to be the, computing the equations or going out there, whatever you do in a physics lab, just an experiment or something to get your feedback and so on. That's the business of physics. And I take the theorizing part to be the actual philosophizing. So if that's the case, then what we have here is theoretical, and they're called this, theoretical physicists. They're really philosophizing. So then the question becomes, well, is their philosophizing correct? You know what I mean? Like, are they doing it well? Is it coherent? Is it consistent with the data and so on and so on? And many times it is. That's fine. But I think it's helpful to, that's the way I view things. I think it's helpful to understand like what it is they're doing so that we don't get this misunderstanding of like, well, scientists said it and it's super authoritative, so I just got to believe whatever it is. I think that they're trafficking in philosophical theories, and sometimes it's done well, but many times it's not done well.
Yeah. So I should qualify what I'm about to say with I am not a physicist. So my degree is in chemical engineering.
I'm not either.
Okay. So yeah, my education is in chemical engineering, and I work in pharma today, so I don't even really use my degree. But I know plenty of people who studied physics, and they might not describe themselves as doing philosophy of science. And I think that the reason why they wouldn't is
I don't think they would either.
Yeah. I didn't think that you did.
No.
But I think that the reason that they would say so is because even the, like, I think you're on to something correct there, where the folks who are actually coming up with, new laws are doing philosophy to some extent. But it's not just like they're thinking about it and then being like, wow, that'd be a cool law. Okay, we're done. Right. Then they're testing it. And so exactly. I think that's why they would call themselves like more scientist than philosopher, is because they're making predictions and then testing those predictions to see if their model is an accurate model or not. And remember, all models are wrong, but some are useful. That's like the engineering mantra is all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so physics, our modern physics, I guarantee you it's wrong. Guaranteed. Mm-hmm. But it's very useful, as is evidenced by, the internet and, the lunar landing and all that stuff. But I think that I think that this kind of attitude of let's theorize, make predictions, and then see if our predictions are accurate has led us to refining our language in a way that is just really, really useful, right? Yeah. All models are wrong, but some are useful. So I think that the language that like modern science employs is just a lot more useful for making correct predictions than scholastic language, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally get that. And I was just talking about this earlier to talk about the usefulness of a model. I was talking to Josh Yen earlier in an interview we did this morning. It'll come out in a couple of weeks, and we were talking about philosophy of science. And I gave the example of miasma theory, which is an old the one that supplanted miasma theory is germ theory.
Germ theory,
in medicine. So obviously that's the one that we take to be correct now, but miasma theory was the one that was, no pun intended, floating around during like the Black Death and so on. So if you remember these, the plague doctors, the one with the beaks, they resurged into popularity during the pandemic, of course, that image. Turns out that what their gear was, what they were wearing, was very useful and successful on both germ theory and miasma theory. So if you were to just use that as an example, like because, well, you're wearing the mask, and of course it blocks miasma is just bad air. It's just literally what it means. So yeah, it blocks bad air, but also blocks germs. So like they're functionally equivalent. I share that example, but it made me think of this idea, like metaphysicians and ontologists, they take themselves to be doing what they call carving the world at its joints, So like taking apart, like not just arbitrary distinctions, let's say, like, so when I identify a substance, that substance is going to be, say, a dog or a table or a slice of bread, whatever it may be. But that distinction is real. It's inherent in reality and not just in my mind. And it's not just a useful fiction that I use to navigate the world. Like, let me give you an example of a bad way of carving up the world. What if I said a substance was you plus the Brooklyn Bridge and all of China? Like, that would be a terrible way to carve up the world. It's such an arbitrary collection or group or set, you know? And so there are some puzzles with this. It's like, what counts? Does a heap, like a pile of sand, count as a substance, or does it not? That's a Sorites paradox. But I mean, so there are problems this runs into, but like their whole project is not just like getting really clear on language so that we can apply it to the world. They take the world to actually be presented. This is a realist approach anyway when it comes to like ontology and theory. They take it to be a real presentation of the world, not just kind of our linguistic, machine trying to be useful with what we take to be the world to be. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. And I mean, so I'm going to agree that there are useful and not so useful ways to think about like objects, like the object that is comprised of like me and your left pinky toe and the Eiffel Tower. Like that's not, it's just, we don't have a word for that because it's not useful. Yeah. And I actually think that everything is like that. Like, I actually just so happen to think that, like Kevin, this thing is equally as real of an object as the object that we haven't. Let's come up with a name right now. How about like, the name of the object is Smorgasbord, and that refers to me, your left toe, and the Eiffel Tower. I actually think that Kevin and Smorgasbord have like an equal claim to having like real ontology. It's just that it's useful to have a word for Kevin because we refer to Kevin all the time.
Why is it? What is usefulness to begin with?
Yeah, it's just something that humans want to talk about.
What are humans then?
Humans are the collections of mereological symbols that other humans refer to as humans. But there's not.
Hold on, you used humans in the definition of humans.
Yeah, and I think I'm okay with that. There's going to be some circularity in all definitions because all definitions are just words. So you can't escape like all definitions ultimately are circular.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure because there's a unity. I would argue there's a unity with respect to Kevin, to you, as a substance that is not present in the smorgasbord example of you or me or left toe and Eiffel Tower. There's just no unity there. And it's not because it's useful. I mean, suppose it became like a really conventional way to refer to those three items and that we did so all the time became useful. Like, sure, but there's still something clunky and awkward about that grouping because there's no unity there. So I take substances just to be that unity.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to like deny this unity point, which I know like people are going to look at me funny now and be like,
it does. So here's why. So it's an indirect argument for unity. If you say, and unity is oneness is one of the transcendentals. Then the transcendentals are agreed upon by Plato, of course, but also by Aristotle, by Aquinas, all really many philosophers, and they're considered traditional. Like the ones agreed upon, of course, are going to be being, unity or oneness, truth, goodness, and then maybe active, like activity, and maybe beauty. But so that everything that exists and has being has these things. And so to have oneness or unity means that it doesn't add anything to being, according to Aquinas, but all beings have unity, just in virtue of being a being. This means that it's indivisible. So that it's a negative kind of understanding. It's something that's indivisible, not divisible. So you might say, well, mereology, like I can break you down to atoms and molecules. Well, those atoms and molecules can be considered to be individuated singles or simples. Does that make sense? So like, what about that? I mean, like what holds them together? And if you want to go, like, it seems like if you want to say, well, everything's just sand and it all breaks down, it's like, well, those things themselves would then break down and then it's like absolute nothingness. So it seems like on pain of this picture where just everything's mush, and at the end of the day, the mush would still have unity because it would be a mush, on pain of that hard, difficult picture, you have to admit that there has to be some sort of unity somewhere.
So I don't think that
whether it begins in substances or not, I think.
Yeah. So I don't think that I do, and here's why. So I do consider myself a mereological nihilist, and so by that I just mean that I think that the only things that actually exist are the simples. Now, what are the simples? We used to think that they were atoms, but then we found out about neutrons and electrons and protons. But then we found out about quarks and leptons, and then we found out that quarks and leptons are probably just excitations in quantum fields. And so now we think that
hold on, not fields, but just a field, like one singular one.
There's various fields, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's not like one field.
Okay.
But so these fields, like the Higgs boson is an excitation in the Higgs field, right? Okay. And the Higgs, so leptons don't come from the same field that the bosons do, right? Now I'm not a physicist, so please don't ask me to actually explain anything that I just said, because I can't. but it doesn't matter, I don't think, how many fields there are. Because
but then the fields would be unities, right? They would be the particulars.
I'd be okay with that. Yeah. So
that's what I'm saying. Like, you have to stop somewhere, and the simples would at least be the unity things. So that makes sense. So then, but why break it down there? What's your motivation for mereological nihilism?
If by motivation we mean like why do I think it's true, I guess in large part that's due to a paper by Ted Sider called Against Parthood. I read this paper and I was like, oh my gosh, Ted Sider, you're a genius. Like, this is absolutely correct. But
who did you read against Sider though?
Well, so everything that I read before Sider was like, I guess mostly scholastic, right? But regardless, I think that so that might answer part of the motivation question. But the other part of the motivation question is I was contemplating things like, okay, so I have an apple and I eat the apple, and the atoms in this apple become part of my body at some point.
Right. I would agree with that analysis.
Yeah. And so at what point do I say that like the atoms of the apple are no longer part of the apple and now they're part of me? It seems like whatever point we pick is going to be arbitrary. And because it is arbitrary, I'm not sure that I can actually insist that there's like some real ontology about appleness and Kevinness. It seems like the boundaries.
Why not just go to DNA?
Because even like DNA can be broken down into its constituent parts. So adenine and guanine and cytosine and thymine. Like if I had a string of adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine all together, and they had their base pairs, would we say that that's DNA if it was just 4 in a row, 4 base pairs? We might be
I don't think you've ever had such a situation, although DNA can degrade. I'm thinking like in crime examples, for example, like if I wanted to know what you ate, I would just run a DNA sample on whatever's in your stomach. And that would tell me that it's not part of you. It's actually part of an apple or part of a steak or part of corn or something.
But
and
even
be able to identify
DNA
that
is
way.
Composed of atoms, right? So it's not like we're escaping this. Like, if the atom in this particular part of the apple becomes part of my cell wall, it never becomes part of my DNA. Is that atom not part of my body because it never became my DNA?
Correct. Yeah.
But it became part of my cell wall. Like it became part of became part of like a mitochondria, or it became part of a ribosome.
Oh, I see. No, I couldn't tell you how digestion works.
Well, so
I couldn't even begin to tell you how the DNA morphs into human DNA. I couldn't even.
So what doesn't have DNA in your body? Not all your cells have DNA. Is it fingernails don't have DNA or something? Is that right? I could be wrong.
Your hair doesn't, except for the root.
The follicle does, but nothing else.
Yeah.
Okay, so theoretically, the apple that I ate a few years ago, there are atoms in this strand of hair right now, and there's no DNA besides the follicle. But there's there's apple atoms, right? That are like in the non-DNA part of my. Are those? Did they revert back to being apple? Like apple atoms now?
No, of course not. So here's how I would analyze that, and I'll use a different example. Like, say my arm gets chopped off. is it still me that, like, my arm laying on the ground? I would say no. My arm is a part of me. I'm right here. It's no longer even part of my body. In fact, I would call it human only in virtue of having human DNA. I would call it human only in virtue of still resembling a human or being a part of a human, potentially a part. So it's helpful to talk about potential parts and then like separable parts and so on. Like, so I think when you were using the DNA example earlier, I think that all the components of DNA are potentially separable parts, but they're not necessarily separated while being part of that DNA. So while they are part of that strand of DNA, they just are the DNA itself. It's just so, my particles that make up me just are making up me now. They're parts of me, but they're not me. So when my arm goes on the ground, gets chopped off or something, it's no longer me. It's a part of me, but it's a former part of me as well. It was a potentially lost, and now it's actually lost. So it's only human in virtue of having once been part of me. So, and we can talk about the apple atoms and so on with respect to that. It would just be like, well, yeah, that bite of that apple is no longer apple in the strict sense of being a unified substance of the apple. It's no longer whole, of course. Now it's well, how would you analyze that? It's a bite of apple. It is a of the apple, so the whole apple isn't present there. It has some DNA and some atoms that were part of the apple, but no longer. They were potentially no longer part of the apple. Now they're actually no longer part of the apple. They are not the apple itself, if that makes sense. I don't know if it's helping.
I don't know if it's
that's
on
how
my
I would
end.
analyze it.
You're starting to break up pretty bad. I think I got most of it. Can you still hear me?
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I can hear you just fine. It looks
Okay.
like my Wi-Fi might be lagging a little bit. Thanks for letting me know.
Yeah, no problem. If I missed something, you'll have to let me know. But so I guess the way that I would respond to, like, if my arm got cut off, would I say that's me on the ground there? I think I would say, well, there's actually no fact of the matter about it, right? Now, in common parlance, right, in the way that we talk, I would say no. Because I think that when people use the grammar, like me or like Kevin anyway, what they're typically referring to mostly is like my brain. Like they might even say that like Kevin said something if I never uttered the words, but I wrote it down. You know what I mean? Like we know what they mean when they talk about Kevin, and that's close enough. But like scientifically speaking, like I don't think that there's an actual fact of the matter about what Kevin is. Because if we do want to try to get like really weird and pedantic about it, then it actually turns out that like there are more I forget the exact statistics, but like there are more non-Kevin cells in my body than there are Kevin cells or something like that, because of all of the gut microbiome that lives within me. Something crazy. And I don't know, there doesn't seem to me to be a non-arbitrary way to make the delineation between where Kevin ends and his environment begins.
You're right. Yeah.
And so to avoid just kind of making an arbitrary cutoff point that I really can't define, I just say, well, maybe I'm just thinking about things wrong. Like maybe I just can be comfortable with the fact that there are no clear delineations and say, yeah, that's fine. That's cool. Nothing's clear. Nature cares a little for human intuition, nature's really weird. And there's simply no easy way to differentiate Kevin from his environment. Or I should say no non-arbitrary way to do so. And so to avoid picking an arbitrary point, I simply don't differentiate.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. So have you read David Barnett's paper, You Are Simple?
No, I don't think I have.
He used to be professor at UC Boulder, Colorado, and was really up and coming on the rise. And then something happened. He stood up for somebody who was like accused of something and then got backlash from that. But also, little known fact, he's the founder of pop sockets, the creator of them. Believe it or not. Yeah. Out of nowhere. Who said philosophers couldn't do anything? So
there you go.
Yeah. He actually, I don't have the book on me, but It's in that volume that I often refer to called The Waning of Materialism. The idea that they came out in 2010, a bunch of like 23, 24 philosophers in that, with all these different essays who share their concerns, their philosophical concerns with materialism as being a way to explain the world. And this can carry over to naturalism as well. But of course, since we're discussing like philosophical anthropology, human beings, then it's applicable to materialism as well. We're talking about matter and so on, mereological nihilism. So yeah, this made me think of this because he imagines, like in this paper, You Are Simple, he imagines like if we were to blow you up, like the size of the universe, like where one atom or one molecule of you was as close to another as we are from like Alpha Centauri. Like that there would be no actual unifying principle, because by the look of it, it looks like, I mean, so this I think he uses this to argue against the mereological nihilist or somebody like materialism. Like if you take that view, there is no unifying principle whatsoever, which seems to be what you're describing. And so there is no you. But he, although it's just a thought experiment, I'm not sure how he brings it back around to a positive argument. I think he rejects that intuition that what this would bring. And he says, no, you are not like that. You are not made of matter. You are simple in the sense of like being non-reductive and inexplainable. Like there is something to you that is unified and basic, so that you can't be just broken apart like that. So anyway, just something I thought of.
I haven't read that one. I will read it though. I just pulled it up. I found the full paper. It's not that long, like 18 pages, so I should be able to read that tonight.
It's a super enjoyable read too.
Van Inwagen has, and so Ted Sider was a student of Peter Van Inwagen. And Van Inwagen makes similar points. He doesn't do this like blowing up to the size of the universe thing. But Van Inwagen is really interesting because he thinks that he's a mereological nihilist about everything except for what he calls the organics. So he would take a look at like, my cell phone or whatever. And Peter Van Inwagen and Ted Sider are in lockstep. They're on the same page. Like, yes, strictly speaking, your phone does not exist. What does exist is the mereological simples arranged phone wise, right? That's right. But then they disagree when it comes to the organics. And so what does Van Inwagen mean by the organics? He's referring to not just me and you, but also dogs and cats, like my cat Angus right here. Cat tax, there he is. But plants and bacteria and all of that. Van Inwagen thinks that there is some kind of, and I think he's pretty okay with, like, I'm going to lovingly call it spooky. I think that he's pretty okay with there being some kind of spookiness to the unity of these organics. But Van Inwagen might take a similar, and I haven't read Barnett, so I don't want to say for sure that they're in total agreement, but they sound like they agree.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I'm not sure, where he is on the map. I've only read that one paper of his, but maybe think of it because you were talking in terms of like, just breaking down to the components, and then you would deny you. But it makes it. Let's talk about the consequences of that, because if you deny that, other than for just the sake of usefulness, which what is usefulness but language and words and tokens and symbols, and I mean. There's no unity to language. There's no unity to individual words. There's no unity to you or me. So that seems like no offense, but it seems like a really bizarre view. That like how would you make sense of anything then? Like who is it that's making sense of anything if there's nobody to make sense of anything?
Yeah, the way that I think about it is that it's only bizarre when you realize it's only bizarre until you realize that most of this is semantics more than anything else, I think.
But semantics don't exist.
Sure. I think that the main thing to realize here is that I don't think that the mereological nihilist and the mereological non-nihilist are looking at the world and actually insisting that it's different than the way that it really is.
Right. Yeah. It's just
precisely. Yeah. So, all that the non-nihilist is doing is adding extra entities into their ontology. You know what I mean? The non-nihilist,
I'm fine with that.
Yeah, because the realist thinks, well, the non-mereological nihilist thinks that they need these extra entities in their ontology in order to explain things.
Yes.
And the mereological nihilist is saying, I can explain all the same stuff just without needing to rely on these additional entities that we're proposing to add to our ontology.
Well, I propose that you would at least need an I that does the explaining to begin with. You would need that to exist. You would need a principle of parsimony to exist in the first place. So it can't be the case that everything breaks down just to molecules and atoms. You would need language to exist, and you would need like reason to exist. You see what I mean? Like, if you don't have those things, then what you're describing just is incoherent. It's just molecules smashing.
What is language? It's molecules smashing, right? So language is air molecules that are vibrating at a certain frequency by the time that they hit your eardrum, among other things. They are also ink splattered across a page, and they are also hand gestures for people who speak sign language. And but all of these things can be described by referring to things like air molecules that are wiggly, ink that is on a page, right? So I just don't think that we need to add this extra thing into our ontology in order to explain what language is, if that makes sense.
Somebody said it well in the chat here that that's phonetics, not semantics. So,
phonetics is probably a better word.
Yeah, of course. So like, I take what when I was calling language earlier, and just to be clear about this, I take it not just to be the sounds that we make, but also the meaning behind it. Of course, that would be the semantical, but also the logical relations that we're identifying that are not just a product of speech. So, I mean, this gets back to like our original conversation with respect to like where their numbers exist. Do you think logical relations exist? Like the facts of logic themselves, I think, have to exist, and they have to exist. I think in a way, maybe not necessarily independent. I think they have to exist independent of human minds. I think that's true. They have to exist independent of the physical world. That would be a different view, an additional view, which would mean I'd have to add things to my ontology, which I'm not necessarily committed to. But I do think that they're mind independent, and they're not constructed. Like you're suggesting that language is kind of just this construct, and we're just playing with symbols and so on. But it doesn't really fully exist. But I think that when we're using language to identify, like the law of excluded middle, either A or not A, like that's not just sounds I'm making. That's a real meaning. Or law of non-contradiction. It's not the case that both A and not A, are true at the same time and in the same sense. Those aren't just like puzzles pieces that I'm just kind of throwing out there and have no meaning, ultimately or something. So I do think these things have to be mind independent. But anyway, your take on that?
Yeah. So I always refer to like, if there is something that's going to make me like, renounce nominalism, it will be something like the laws of logic.
Yeah.
However, I have some reservations, and so I'll spell out those reservations here. But like with the kind of, the preamble being like, but I recognize the problem here. I'm not trying to brush anything under the rug.
Of course.
But here are some reservations. So all Catholics already reject the laws of logic. And they do so because of the Trinity, the LPT, the logical problem of the Trinity. So now there's solutions to the logical problem of the Trinity.
Do you mean the idea that 3 can't equal 1?
Yeah, so it would be something like this.
I don't think that entails that Catholics reject logic.
So consider something like this.
Okay.
Jesus is God. Catholics affirm, right?
Yeah.
God the Father is God.
Yes.
Catholics affirm. Jesus is God the Father. Catholics do not affirm.
No, of course not.
Right. So the laws of logic appear not to work here.
They appear. Do you mind if I interject? They appear to work quite well, actually, because we can say that my hand is Derek, my foot is Derek. therefore my hand equals my foot, or my hand is my foot. That's actually a fallacy of not the undistributed middle is what that's called. So another example would be the idea that all black and white things are penguins. Penguins are black and white things. Old TV shows are black and white things. Therefore, penguins are old black and white old TV shows, and that just doesn't follow, And I think also it helps to get clear. So that's the fallacy of undistributed middle. They're using some middle terms there, namely God and Jesus, this first person of the Trinity, second person of the Trinity, the Father and the Son. And it's also get clear on what do you mean by is. So Jesus is God. Is that an identity relation? I don't think that it is. Like Jesus is identical to God. I think that it's an essential predication. I think that Jesus is God essentially. Like saying that it's part of his essence. I don't think he's identical to God, because that would mean that he's identical to all three members of the Trinity, which isn't the case. Same thing with God the Father. I don't think the same thing's happening there. I think it's an essential predication. So to say, that's why I use the example of my hand. My hand is Derek. My foot is Derek. Derek's hand is Derek. Derek's foot is Derek. Therefore, Derek's hand is Derek's foot. It's just not going to be the case, because you're using like essential predication, then you're trying to derive from that an identity relation, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So the is of predication is certainly different than the is of identity. And I don't think that that's going to be a huge problem to the logical problem of the Trinity. And the reason I say that is because most Christian philosophers that I'm aware of are perfectly happy to acknowledge the logical problem of the Trinity. And they'll say, it is a heresy to say that, all right. So like the Father is God. And I pulled up the actual paper. It's from 20 something. Oh, maybe it makes sense for me to share it.
That'd be fine. Yeah. Who's the author on that?
Oh, good Lord. I do not remember. Let me scroll up to the top and we'll find out together. Okay. So here it is. I'm going to come back to chapter 1, but if I go all the way up here,
you might need to zoom in a little bit given how small it looks for us, but yeah. Okay. Bo Branson. Okay. It's his dissertation.
And this was a dissertation. Yeah.
Cool.
And so then we scroll down to chapter 1 and he lays out the neat little syllogism. So yeah, the neat little syllogism goes as follows. The Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, the Father is not the Son, the Father is not the Holy Spirit, the Son is not the Holy Spirit, and there is exactly one God. And so arguing that the is in the Father is God isn't an is of identity, but is only an is of
essential predication.
Yeah, would be, and this always feels weird for me to say, but I've had Catholics tell me that would be heresy to insist that the Father is not God in in terms of identity, but is only predication. So again, I'm not.
Well, it's an essential predicate. It's not an accidental predication. So I think to say like that the Father is God only contingently, obviously that's a heresy. But to say that the Father is God essentially, that's just his nature to be God, and if you were to take that away, he wouldn't be what he is. I think that's all that's being said by a claim of essential predication. But I could be wrong about that, but that's what I take that to mean. It's not. I don't think it in any way demeans God that would make it border upon heresy. But maybe I'm wrong about that.
I mean, maybe like a simple way to ask the question would be like, and you don't have to answer this question right now if you don't. If you just need to think about it, but would you deny? So let me say is A and is B, where is A is the is of identity. Would you deny that the Father is a God, or is prime? Maybe I should say is prime is the is of identity. Would you deny that the Father is prime God, and would you deny that the Son is prime God, and would you deny that the Holy Spirit is prime God? And again, you don't have to answer that, but to deny that. Most Trinitarians would call that heresy. I'm not. I wouldn't. But so how do they get around this? There's plenty of solutions to the logical problem of the Trinity, but they just all rely on non-classical logic, and that's the reason why I brought up the logical problem of the Trinity. Is because of all of these non-classical logics which people use to solve the logical problem of the Trinity. If we, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm not at all well versed in non-classical logics, but there's like one simple move, and it has a label, and I don't remember what the label is, but like you just deny the principle of non-contradiction, or you deny the law of excluded middle. You deny one of them or something, and then the entire logical problem of the Trinity just disappears.
Oh yeah. But I wouldn't do that. Yeah. So it seems to me, I've not read this dissertation. It seems to me, given that he puts it out in the first chapter, that he's thereby in the remainder of the dissertation probably going to explore responses to it, and that would be one response, probably not the only one, certainly not the only one, because that is a it's called a three-place logic, or it rejects a bivalent logic. So it's going to deny the principle of non-contradiction and deny the law of excluded middle. But it's called a multivariate logic or something like that. But yeah, there's different names for it, but you find that over in like Eastern philosophy systems a lot. Something could be both true and not true at the same time. It's sort of this third place, multi-place logic.
Yeah.
And Western logic, especially is not just a product of their environment. They just reject that. It's just incoherent. How can something both exist and not exist at the same time in the same sense? It's just incoherent.
Yeah. And to your point about all the different possible solutions, if I had just scrolled a few more pages, we would have started all the different proposed solutions.
Yeah.
But just look at them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 6 at least just in the intro in chapter 1. And then if you want to start subdividing them, you have all the different possible solutions down there. So there's a lot of proposed solutions. But the reason I bring this up is because I and maybe it's because I'm not a logician, but I hear people making arguments for why we should accept these non-classical logics. And I start thinking to myself, like, oh man, like they sound really smart. Maybe they have a point.
No, I'd resist that, because that means that it could be possible that you both accept them and don't accept them. And that seems to me to be, again, incoherent, because that's what you're really accepting. You're accepting that you should both affirm A and reject A. Like, if that seems reasonable to you, then go ahead and accept it, but also be willing to not accept it at the same time and in the same sense. And just, again, it's incoherent. So, like, you know what I mean?
Yeah. But I guess just to kind of zoom back out, one of my hesitancies, so like, Kevin, why aren't you a realist when you already admitted that, the laws of logic give you at least pause about nominalism? And the reason I don't is because it seems like there are different logics out there. There isn't just one logic. And there appear to be more than one set of logical laws that will get us to models of reality that make sense. So given all of that, like that gives me pause about the pause that I, you know what I mean?
It's interesting you bring that up, because he was in the chat earlier, maybe still here, but Digital Gnosis, Nathan, he and I were talking about this on the call-in show last week, different forms of logic. But I think those only start to differ unless you're talking about the multi-place logic of the Eastern worldviews, which I totally reject because it's incoherent. Then there are still other systems, like of modal logic, of different quantifiable predicate logic, and so on. But I think at that point you're dealing with such complex systems that it's only going to really affect complex claims. So when you're just talking about basic claims like the law of non-contradiction, law of excluded middle, none of those Western systems that you see so much variance in are going to deny those. Those are the basic building blocks. So if you're just talking about simple claims like that, everybody agrees on those.
Yeah. But I might kind of think about, and I'm going to bring it back to science just because that's kind of my bread and butter. I might think about like classical logic as Newtonian physics, where like Newtonian physics is wrong. Like we know it's not a perfectly accurate model to describe the universe. But man, is it really close. Like, it's good. It's really good.
Yeah.
It carried us from the 17th century through until the 20th. I mean, think about all the advancements that we made, like technologically speaking, from the 1600s through until 1900 and like 1910 and stuff like that. Think about all of that.
Yeah.
You know, we did that. We did all of that with Newtonian mechanics.
Yeah.
And so I think of classical logic as the same way. It's really good. But when we get to those really complex spaces, just like when we get to really complex physical spaces, that's when we need to start relying on things like general relativity, which of course is not Newtonian. And we might also have to start relying on non-classical logic. And so the way that I think about that is, if I'm not willing to kind of bite the bullet and say that Newtonian physics, like, it's real, it exists because it does such a, I'm not willing to do that because Newtonian physics is not perfect. So why would I bite the bullet, I guess, on logic being real if I'm not willing to you know what I mean?
I have a good answer for you. I think there's a disanalogy here because it's not the case that, say, new logical systems of the Western world, we're talking like Frege's logic, we're talking about modal logic. It's not the case that they just completely wholesale reject classical logic as just being all false. I think they start with that and then they build upon it. So they just saw it as incomplete and they're building to it. I mean, it is a bit of a misnomer because it's like, oh, it's no longer called that, but it could have been called like version 2 of classical logic. See what I mean? Like, it's not that anybody's denying those, unless, again, you're in those Eastern world views, which I think are incoherent.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I don't think that Einstein was denying that force is equal to mass times acceleration either. You know what I mean? I think all ideas are standing on the shoulders of giants, like the ideas that came before them. So I'm not certain that I'm willing to like throw out Newtonian physics, even though I might say these really mean things about it. You know, I might.
Yeah, it does. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not really up on my physics. But it seems to me that it has limited application, and Newtonian physics does. That is Newtonian mechanics, but that it's short-sighted, if that's a good word to use, because it's not going to be applicable to like larger swaths, let's say, of space-time, in space, and it's not going to be applicable to the quantum world. But like, for the most part, it seems like with that limited application, it's highly successful, and it's probably like smack on right with respect to like that limited scope. Does that take your so if that's the case, then it's not fully fair to say that Newtonian mechanics and Newtonian physics was just wrong. It's just like that's like saying, I mean, maybe I'm wrong about this, but that would be given the example I used earlier, miasma theory, that was just wrong because it was saying that air does it, and it's just false to say that air does it. It's germs that does it, that makes you sick. Air doesn't make you sick. So that was just a false claim. So it's my understanding that that's not what's going on in Newtonian physics mechanics. It's just that they have limited application.
Yeah, if you tried to do Newtonian physics to model the motion of Jupiter around the sun, it would be wrong. And the reason it would be wrong is because it doesn't work that well at, the millions of miles distance between Jupiter and the sun. And it doesn't take into its theory of gravity is actually not quite right. So is it wrong? I'm going to be honest. I don't think that physics and science in general has a concept of right and wrong. It just has a concept of all models are wrong, but some are useful. Yeah, like that. It's kind of a mantra at this point. But it doesn't do a very good job. Newtonian physics doesn't do a very good job of modeling planetary motion. It also doesn't do a very good job of explaining subatomic interactions. Obviously, though, of course. So, and general relativity does a much better job. To the point where we've been trying really hard to prove it wrong for the past 100 years, and we haven't yet. Will we someday? I'm almost positive that we will. Almost positive. I'm almost positive that Einstein was wrong.
Mhm.
But man, we've been trying really hard and we haven't cracked it yet. But it took us 400 years to
Yeah.
figure out that Newton was wrong, and it's only been 100 for Einstein so far. So we've got
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Yeah. I haven't really thought about this all that much. Yeah. But so would you agree then that yeah, it's really hard. Like, it's hard to say that it's true with respect to this limited scope. It's not like, if we were to use an analogy like laws, it is true that this is the law with respect to this country and it has limited scope because it only applies to things in this country, let's say. But then again, there's some like vagueness here because it can apply to citizens who aren't present in the country. It can apply to maritime, edges of the sea that aren't within the physical boundaries. It can apply to territory. So it has some limited application, but it's not going to have universal application. So it seems like that if you wanted to use this analogy, that would be like Newtonian stuff. And then like the general relativity would be like let's say like universal, United Nations international laws or something like that.
Yeah. I live in Kentucky. And so if I had some kind of idea that this law, that it's illegal to buy, I don't want to use words, but there are recreational substances that are legal in other states that are not legal in Kentucky. And so if I lived my whole life here and I just kind of took it as like this universal law, that would actually work well enough for me because it's true. I'm not allowed to purchase those things here. But if I went outside of Kentucky, if I went to Colorado, for instance, then I could.
And you'd be mistaken about your former belief that it were the case everywhere. Yeah.
And Newtonian physics is like that.
Yeah.
And I used to be really mean to Aristotle because Aristotle said all these crazy things. Like he had these two different theories of motion. There was violent motion and natural motion. He also thought that like rocks settled further into the ground over time because like that was in their nature to do so. Like that's just how rocks are. So I used to make fun of him all the time. And then I read this really interesting paper that was pretty much saying, no, you're not giving Aristotle enough credit. So what Einstein did to Newton did to Aristotle. Aristotle's physics, his physics, no air quotes, because let's not forget that he wrote a book called Physics. Now, what he meant by physics was different than what Newton meant. But regardless, his physics actually work kind of well if we are restricting ourselves to the scale of, as small as an apple and as big as a house. And we're only talking about the surface of planet Earth. Right. Then his physics kind of work. Like it's kind of good.
Right.
And there's a reason why it took us 2,000 years to get from Aristotle to Newton. It's because his physics worked well enough for our purposes. Sorry, that was like a tangent.
Nah, it's interesting because this is neither here nor there, but physika in the Greek just translates to nature. So he's really just describing nature, and that's just what the word physics means.
I actually didn't know that. That's cool.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So it's not, again, he's pre-scientific. It's interesting you mentioned that because I think Anaximander, it was either him or Anaximenes, but I always get them confused. But Anaximander, I think, was the guy who was one of the four like horsemen of pre-Socratic philosophers who each came up with like an element of what they thought the world was, the arche, what they thought all of reality broke down to. And Anaximander also had this view, like this weird pre-evolutionary view that a lot of people just sort of just like tossed away as being like, this guy didn't know what he's talking about. He was describing things that leave the moisture, leave the ocean, let's say, and then change their form and then go on to live their life elsewhere. And that sounds like evolution, like fish becoming humans or whatever, in a really simplistic view. But he also added in between there that they form hard shells. And we're like, that doesn't make sense. What is he talking about? He's an idiot, whatever. Turns out in a later paper that he was redeemed after, 2,500 years, that there was this kind of like interesting insect, this type of fly that had this exact life cycle. So he could have been, inspired by that somehow. So all that to say, like these ancients, we like to think of ourselves as like really well informed and very, very, very learned, and brighter and smarter than all those primitive idiot people. And easy to fall into that trap. But it turns out like if you have a little bit of charity in reading them and just like kind of try to inhabit what they were thinking in their minds, then you actually find some pretty astounding discoveries. Yeah.
I'm convinced that there is no human alive today that we could send back in time to 3,000 years or whatever who would actually make a difference to scientific discovery. And I don't only mean because they couldn't convince people. I mean because they couldn't demonstrate. Because, you know, everything that we, you know, do today, like we are all standing on the shoulders of giants. And we might think of Einstein as our giant, but Einstein's giant was Newton, and Newton's giant was Aristotle. So like, you know, I definitely used to be a lot meaner to Aristotle and the other ancients and stuff. And then I started reading a little bit more and I was like, you know what? I think I've been way too harsh on my friend Aristotle. And I think that, you know, he deserves a lot more credit than I used to give him. That's for sure.
Yeah, he often gets written off for his views on physics and especially biology.
He gets all those animal facts wrong.
Yeah,
hilariously wrong.
Yeah, but it is worth saying that like he actually did a lot of empirical research as a philosopher, which is surprising. He did a lot of empirical research on the islands off the coast of Turkey, modern day Turkey. So he was like trying to do both, you know, at the same time. He was just like a real master. And got pretty far with it. But of course he's working. Who is his giant that he's standing on? That's why he's so impressive. You know, it was Plato, but his metaphysics was totally opposite and inverted. So you would never catch Plato out there doing empirical research because he thinks the forms are somewhere else. He can do philosophy in his armchair. He doesn't have to go out there and investigate. The real things aren't out there.
Aristotle, like he wasn't doing the scientific method that like he wasn't doing what we would call science today, but he was very much so doing like proto-science or something, you know, like he was laying the groundwork for what we would eventually call science. And somebody says like, wasn't Aristotle a good entomologist? Is that like the animal facts stuff?
Yeah.
The one thing that I remember is he like observed octopuses changing color or something. Like that's like the thing. Like he wrote about how octopuses can change color. And like, why did he know that? Because he went out and he just like watched octopuses, I guess, and like wrote it down. Like, I don't know. I think that's kind of cool.
You're not going to get that just from sitting in a chair and thinking about the nature of octopuses, you know?
Nope. That's proto-science right there.
And yet he doesn't even have the title, believe it or not, to the father of science or the founder of science. That goes to either Anaximander or Thales. Each of whom was also known for their like empirical research, but also their skill in engineering. I think Thales there's a big story about him. Well, he predicted an eclipse, a solar eclipse, like pretty impressive. And he might have gotten that from Egyptians or Persians, but he predicted an eclipse, and he used that knowledge to. Everybody's making fun of him, like, why aren't you out here doing stuff and you're just philosophizing? He used that knowledge to buy up he knew there was going to be a bumper crop of grapes or olives or whatever it was. And he bought up all the presses and then made a killing, you know, and like he had to, like he rented them out to people, you know.
That's amazing. I
just
did
to
not know
show
this
and to
story.
demonstrate and to prove to people, like, if I wanted to, but I don't want to because philosophers are interested in something far higher, you know. But he sure was like no slouch. And he also, there's a story of him helping to ford a river for the Lydian army. This army was going, they couldn't cross the river, so he forded it, like meaning he split it into two so that it became shallower on each side, and so the army could cross. It's like a philosopher doing that, but that's why he's often known as the first scientist.
Who was that? That was Anaximander?
That was Thales. Thales of Miletus. Thales. Let me put that in the chat.
That's like so cool. I'm gonna I'm, you know, when
He's
I'm like
great,
working, when I've got my nose in a spreadsheet tomorrow during work, I'm gonna pull up some like podcast all about Thales or something to get all my
Hey, you know who's got a great one? Just look up Hopwag. It's a history, stands for History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. It's this guy who's at the University of London or University King's College London, something like that. And he's got some great. He starts with the pre-Socratics and he goes worldwide, over in the Islamic world, over in the Far East. He does not skip no gaps, no nothing. And I think, as far as I can tell, he's not even to the modern period. I think he's probably still in like late medieval or Renaissance, maybe. But he's been doing this for like over a decade. Podcasts like every week.
I think I found him on YouTube.
Yeah, he's great, and he's also got books. He's got at least 3 volumes that these podcasts had just taken the transcript and like put them in book form. Is like a nice history of philosophy. So those podcast episodes, they're pretty short. They run really nice. He's got a script he reads from, and it's pretty informative. And he brings on experts sometimes. I think even by like the 6th episode, he's already bringing somebody to talk about Plato or something.
That's really cool. I know.
Highly recommend.
I know which podcast I'll be listening to tomorrow during work. That's for sure.
Nice. Yeah, Peter Adamson. That's what someone said here. He's on Descartes now. Golly, that is progress, man. Like, what are we doing with our lives?
I know.
Yeah.
Not enough.
Cool. Well, man, let's put a pin in it there, and I'd like to have it back on sometime.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, I loved our conversation. I'm really happy that I was able to at least keep pace. Sometimes people tell me, they're like, wow, like, I don't know half these words that you're saying. And I say, good, because I don't know them either. I'm just really good at faking it.
Yeah. Well, talking about it helps, I couldn't tell you, and probably is a good thing, because if I knew all the arguments for and against, I'd be like, why are you saying these things? You know what I mean? Like, so again, like, I'm only slightly conversational in these things. I still had to do some reading up on, especially the views on universals and everything. I will say this, I'll show you the books that I was reading up on. This one's nice, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview by J.P. Moreland, William Lane Craig. Both of these guys are my professors. Love JP. He's great. He's also got a small, tiny book. I can't seem to find it. It has escaped me in the moves, but JP's got a tiny book called Universals, and he's the realist that I was referring to earlier.
Okay.
And I've also got this book is really nice. Michael J. Liu, just metaphysics, just a little textbook. I've got the 3rd edition. Maybe he's updated it, but he's got a nice. I'll show you in the table of contents. He's got a nice evaluation of our discussion here. So I didn't read the whole thing, but problem universals from a realist point of view, and then problem universals from a nominalist point of view.
Ooh,
so
I'm gonna have to pick that one up
right there. Yeah, and it goes really into depth into all the arguments. You got something similar in that big volume, Philosophical Foundations. So if you want to look those up, they're pretty great. More than enough that you would need.
Yeah, most of the reading that I've done on the realist side in particular has been philosophers who I'm truthfully not the biggest fans of. It's going to be like Ed Feser.
Ed Feser gets a mention in one of these. This is the one. Sorry to interrupt. I'll let you continue. But this is the one that I was. This is just a journal, Philosophia Christi, the Evangelical Philosophical Society, and the debate was, if you can see it there.
I might need to
right there
make you bigger on my screen. Let's see if I can find it.
It was
William Lane Craig, Van Inwagen,
and then a third
multiple
dude,
times.
J. Thomas Bridges. So everything from here to here is a debate between these 3 guys.
Oh, that's fun.
So if you can get this volume, you can probably find them independently online, but just look up Craig, God and Abstract Objects in Philosophia Christi that came out of 2015. And I think all their stuff's online now. But Craig, Thomas Bridges uses Ed Feser, like you mentioned, and then Craig's like, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's talking about nominalism, Aquinas being an anomalist. Yeah, so interesting. But anyway, you said you read somebody like Feser, and who else?
Yeah, Oderberg, and I liked Oderberg a lot more than Feser personally.
Is it David Oderberg?
Yes, yeah, David Oderberg.
Okay, yeah, because he has some really great stuff on ethics as well. That's the stuff I know him for. I don't know him for the metaphysics.
I've only read Real Essentialism. Real Essentialism is the only Oderberg that I've read.
Interesting. He's great, and he's a really good writer. I didn't realize he did metaphysics as well.
Maybe I have to check out his ethics stuff, because I only know Real Essentialism. Yep. So,
and probably really good for the meta ethics part too. That a lot of that is metaphysics as well. Yeah, but he's really clear, clear writer.
Yeah, I like him.
Cool. Yeah.
All right.
So somebody said here, real quick before we go, Van Andwagen and Craig also have a debate on YouTube about abstract objects. That's really cool.
That's fun. I
have to look that up. There's another thing you could listen to tomorrow.
There we go. I've got my homework.
Craig is a nominalist, and as far as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, somebody, I think Van Andwagen is he's a realist. But Craig is a nominalist for the very reason because it impinges on the sovereignty of God.
Oh, interesting. That's why he's a nominalist, kind of.
Yeah. He doesn't even want. He doesn't want to touch realism at all. And in fact, interestingly, like I say, Moreland and Craig, like Craig right here, he's the nominalist, JP is the realist. So you get kind of, I think you only get JP's view in this because they traded off doing chapters. And so Moreland got the realism in there that Craig probably didn't like. Anyway, all right, sorry, man, it's been a pleasure, and
this was a blast.
I will talk to you another time. All right,
looking forward to it.
All right, see ya.
All right, bye.